November 12, 1943, 2:14 in the morning. The North Atlantic. Inside the steel coffin of U-537, 200 feet below the surface, the air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and something else. Something Thomas Weber recognized immediately. Fear. He gripped the valve wheel with both hands, his knuckles white in the red glow of the control room. 24 years old, a machinist from Dresden, a son, a brother, a sailor who had joined the Kriegsmarine believing the promises of a 1,000-year Reich, and now in this moment probably about to die. The sonar operator ripped his headphones off. His face was pale, slick with sweat. ASDIC contact. Close. Starboard side. Captain Schroeder's voice cut through the tension. Rig for silent running, flood negative. Take us to 200 meters. Schnell. The boat tilted downward. The angle was steep. Too steep. Thomas felt his stomach drop as the submarine dove deeper into the crushing black. Around him, men braced against pipes and bulkheads, their eyes wide, their breathing shallow. Then it came. The sound. Ping, ping, ping. High-pitched, metallic. The sonar pulse of the destroyer hunting them. An invisible finger pointing directly at their hull. Thomas had heard it twice before on previous patrols, but that sound never became familiar. It never lost its power to turn blood to ice. They are right on top of us, someone whispered. The first depth charge exploded close. So close the concussion slammed the submarine sideways. Thomas was thrown against a pipe. Pain shot through his shoulder. Around him, light bulbs shattered. Cork insulation rained down from the ceiling. And then a new sound began. The shriek of stressed metal. The groan of a steel hull being crushed by pressure it would never design to withstand. Water sprayed from a ruptured pipe in the engine room. The spray was cold, forceful, cutting through the stale air like a knife. Another explosion. Closer this time. The boat shuddered. A valve near Thomas's station gave way. More water. The pressure gauges spun wildly. Red lights flashed across the control panel. Depth 220 meters, the chief engineer screamed. The aft torpedo room is flooding. We cannot hold her. Captain Schroeder stood at the periscope, his face illuminated by the dim red emergency lights. For a moment, he was utterly still. Then he spoke, his voice, quiet but clear. They have us. We are too deep, too damaged. Surface. Surface. Blow all tanks. The sickening lurch of the emergency ascent followed. Thomas clung to the valve wheel as the boat rocketed upward. A wounded whale desperate for air. His stomach churned. His ears popped. Around him, men were praying in whispered German. Some were crying. The submarine broke the surface with a violent crash. Freezing Atlantic water poured through the open conning tower hatch. Captain Schroeder climbed the ladder first. Thomas followed, his hands shaking on the cold metal rungs. He burst onto the deck. The air hit him like a physical blow. Cold. So cold it burned his lungs. The taste of salt and cordite filled his mouth. And then the light. A blinding white beam pinned them from the darkness. It came from the high steel gray cliff of a destroyer bearing down on them. The ship was massive, far larger than Thomas had imagined. The bow wave pushed white foam into the black water. A voice amplified by a bullhorn cut through the wind. The accent was American. Do not attempt to scuttle your vessel. Abandon ship immediately. I say again, abandon your vessel. We are preparing to fire. Captain Schroeder raised his hands. The fight was over. He turned to his crew, his face etched with exhaustion and something else. Relief perhaps, or resignation. Into the water, he said quietly, now. Thomas slid down the slick hull and hit the Atlantic. The cold was of violence. It stole his breath. His vision blurred. His limbs went instantly numb. For a moment, he thought he might simply sink. But then a rope hit the water beside him. Strong hands pulled. He was hauled, gasping and shivering, onto the deck of the destroyer. The first thing he saw was the ship's name painted on a life ring, USS Benson. The second thing was an American sailor. Big, built like a lumberjack. The sailor shoved a rough wool blanket into Thomas's chest. His voice was gruff but not unkind. Get below, now. There was no rifle butt to the face. No spit, no triumphant kick. Just the blanket, just the order. Thomas stumbled down a ladder, his legs barely working, his body shaking violently from the cold. He and his surviving crewmates were herded into a warm mess deck. They collapsed onto the floor, dripping seawater onto clean linoleum. A medic moved among them, checking for wounds. His touch was efficient, businesslike, almost gentle. This was the first psychological shock. Thomas Weber had been trained to expect brutality. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were savage, hateful. They would torture captured Germans. They would mock them, beat them, starve them. But the medic simply wrapped a bandage around a cut on Thomas's forehead and moved on to the next man. No words, no cruelty, just professional care. Thomas sat against the bulkhead, wrapped in the scratchy wool blanket, staring at nothing. Around him, his comrades were silent, faces pale, eyes hollow. They were warriors of the Reich, wolves of the sea. They had been prepared for a vengeful enemy. They were not prepared for this old, almost bored professionalism. 3 days later, they landed at Halifax, Nova Scotia. The port was a chaos of steel and smoke. Warships everywhere. Destroyers, corvettes, cargo ships being loaded with tanks and trucks and crates of ammunition. The scale of it was staggering. Thomas had known intellectually that America was an industrial power, but seeing it was different. This was production. This was abundance. This was a machine that could not be stopped. They were marched under guard into a processing depot, a massive building that smelled of disinfectant and coffee. Inside, Thomas saw thousands of other prisoners. The variety of uniforms was overwhelming. Sun-baked tunics of the Deutsches Afrika Korps captured in Tunisia, Fallschirmjäger paratroopers from Sicily, Luftwaffe ground crews from France, Kriegsmarine sailors like himself, even a few Italians looking lost and afraid. They were a broken army, all funneled to this strange new continent. And here Thomas met his permanent guards, the Veterans Guard of Canada. Thomas watched them confused. These were not the elite stormtroopers he had been told defended the Allied homelands. These were old men. Their faces were lined, their hair was gray. Many wore ribbons from a war Thomas had only read about in history books. Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, 1918. They walked with limps. They smoked pipes. They moved slowly, deliberately, like men who had seen too much and were too tired to care about posturing. A Wehrmacht officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Steiner, stepped forward, stiff-backed, arrogant even in his torn, salt-stained uniform. He clicked his heels and addressed the nearest guard. "I am a German officer. I demand to speak to your commandant immediately." The guard was a sergeant, perhaps 60 years old. Grizzled, his face was weathered like old leather. He chewed on his pipe stem and looked the German officer up and down slowly. "That's Major Patterson, sir, and he'll see you when he's ready. Until then, you'll stand here with the rest." Steiner's face flushed red. "I demand respect. I am an officer of the Wehrmacht." The sergeant's expression did not change. His voice never rose. It remained flat. "Matter of fact, son, I gave 4 years in France, 17 to 18. I've seen enough demanding to last a lifetime. Form up by threes." The politeness was a weapon. It was disarming. The prisoners were braced for brutality, which would have validated their Nazi propaganda. They were met instead with rules, with orderly, mundane, unshakable authority. It was profoundly unsettling. They were marched to a railway station. Thomas expected cattle cars. They were, after all, prisoners. The enemy. Instead, they were loaded onto colonist cars, old but functional passenger trains, wooden benches, a pot-bellied stove in the center, and windows, actual windows. They were given rations for the journey, tins of corned beef, hardtack biscuits, and a large metal drum of hot sweet tea. A guard from the Veterans Guard moved down the aisle handing out cigarettes, 2 to each German NCO. "Don't smoke them all at once, boys. It's a long trip." The train gave a heavy jolt and began to move. Thomas pressed his face to the dirty glass, watching the gray city of Halifax recede. He was moving west. He knew nothing of this country. In his mind, Canada was a fiction, a vast, frozen wasteland attached to America. Nothing more. He and the other prisoners assumed they would be in a new city by nightfall. The train picked up speed. Thomas watched the landscape begin to change. The sparse coastal settlements gave way to trees, just trees. A dense, unbroken forest of pine and spruce stretching from the tracks to the horizon. Hours passed, the sun shifted across the sky. The train clattered on. Thomas looked out the window. Trees. He dozed off, his head rattling against the wooden wall. The motion of the train was hypnotic. The warmth from the stove was the first comfort he had felt in days. He woke hours later. The sun was setting. He looked out the window. There was nothing, nothing but trees and rocks and lakes. An endless, empty, magnificent, and terrifying wilderness. A soldier from the Africa Corps, a young man named Klaus Brenner, sat across from Thomas. His face was pressed to the glass. His eyes were wide. "Where are the cities?" Klaus whispered. Thomas looked at him. He had no answer. "Where are the farms? Where are the people?" The train whistled, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed and died in the vast, dark emptiness beyond the windows. The realization was just beginning to dawn. They were not just being imprisoned. They were being swallowed. The train ride became a form of temporal distortion. One day passed, then two. They crossed from Nova Scotia through New Brunswick and into the vastness of Quebec. The landscape was relentless. Forest, rock, lakes the size of inland seas, and no sign of human civilization beyond the occasional lonely station where the train paused to take on water. Lieutenant Colonel Steiner tried to maintain discipline. He ordered his men to perform calisthenics in the aisle. Jumping jacks, push-ups against the seats. The Canadian guards simply watched, sipping their tea, their expressions unreadable. They did not interfere. They did not need to. The train was a sealed world rattling through a void. By the third day, the prisoners' conversations had faded. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen, bewildered silence. They were deep in Ontario now, a province Thomas had never heard of, but which seemed impossibly to be larger than Germany itself. "This is a trick," a young Luftwaffe pilot muttered to Thomas, his face pressed to the glass. "They are driving us in circles. No country can be this nothing." Thomas shook his head. "The sun is constant, Hans. We are still moving west. Look," he pointed. The landscape had changed. Now it was a brutal alien world of black rock, sharp cliffs, stunted wind-blasted pines, the Canadian Shield. A geological formation so ancient it predated the dinosaurs. So vast it covered half the continent. "There are no farms," Klaus said. His voice was hollow. He was used to the desert, but that was a desert of sand. This was a desert of stone and water. Nothing can live here. "Where are they taking us?" The train passed a lake. An hour later it passed another, and another. These were not ponds. These were inland seas of cold, dark water, stretching to horizons of their own. The sheer, raw emptiness of the land began to feel like an active, hostile force. In Europe, escape was a matter of navigating Peopletown's borders. Here Thomas realized the very concept of escape was a joke. To where? On the fourth day, Lieutenant Colonel Steiner stood. His face was pale. His uniform, already rumpled and stained, hung awkwardly on his frame. He addressed Sergeant McBride, one of the Canadian Guards. "Sergeant, we demand to know our destination. This is a violation of the Geneva Convention. We are being transported to nowhere." McBride finished tapping his pipe against his boot heel. He looked at the German officer. For the first time, he seemed almost amused. "Violation, son. You're not even in Minnesota yet. You've got another day to go." He unfolded a simple paper map from his pocket and flattened it on his knee. The Germans crowded the aisle to look. McBride pointed with his pipe stem. "We started here. Halifax." His finger rested on a tiny dot on the eastern edge of the map. "We're about here." His finger moved, barely an inch across the paper. "And we're taking you here." His finger landed on a nearly invisible dot on the northern shore of Lake Superior, next to a town called Grand Marais, Minnesota. Lieutenant Colonel Steiner's face drained of color. The map showed their journey so far had been a mere crawl from the eastern edge. They were insects being carried across a continent. The polite guard had not just answered the question. He had, with a simple piece of paper, utterly dismantled the officer's worldview. The prisoners returned to their seats. The psychological blow was more effective than any beating. They were for the first time truly insignificant. On the fifth day, the train finally slowed. The brakes screeched in the immense silence. "Right, lads, end of the line, everybody out." Thomas stepped down from the train. His legs were stiff. The air was different here. So clean and cold it stung his lungs. And the sound, there was none. Only the wind whistling through the pines, and a low, distant roar. He looked around. There was no station. There was no town. There was only a rough wooden platform, a siding, and a muddy track leading into the forest. In the distance he saw it, Camp Northwood. It was brand new. The raw yellow wounds of cut lumber stark against the dark green of the forest. Rows of wooden barracks, a cookhouse, a hospital, all surrounded by two massive fences of barbed wire, wooden guard towers at each corner. It was a prison identical to 100 others Thomas had heard of, but the context was what broke them. Behind the camp, the forest loomed, a solid 1,000-foot-high green wall. It was not the managed civilized forest of the Schwarzwald. It was a tangled, primeval mass of spruce, birch, and rock. And in front of the camp, through a break in the trees, Thomas saw the source of the roar. He walked mesmerized with the other prisoners as they were herded toward the gate. He saw Lake Superior. It was not a lake. It was an ocean, a freshwater sea of churning gray, lethally cold water that disappeared into a horizon as flat and absolute as the Atlantic they had crossed weeks before. Klaus Brenner, walking beside Thomas, dropped his small bundle of belongings. His voice broke. Another ocean. We crossed the ocean to get to another ocean. They were marched through the gates. The guards of the Veterans Guard motioned them into assembly. The camp commandant, Major Samuel Patterson, stood on the steps of the mess hall. He was tall, thin, perhaps 58 years old. He wore the same weary 1918 ribbons as his men. He spoke in German, passable, formal, grammatically correct. Welcome to Camp Northwood, gentlemen. You are prisoners of war under the authority of the United States Army. You will be treated in strict accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will be fed. You will be housed. He paused. He looked past them out toward the impenetrable forest, then to the deadly expanse of the lake. We have rules here, but I advise you to look around. You will find that he gestured to his elderly guards who stood relaxed, rifles slung over their shoulders, are not your primary jailers. This, he swept his arm at the wilderness. This is your prison. There are no towns for 200 miles, no farms, no roads, only rock, water, timber, and in winter cold that will kill you in an hour. Attempting escape is not brave, it is suicide. We will not hunt you. We will simply collect your bodies in the spring. The speech was delivered not as a threat, but as a simple, polite statement of fact. Thomas was assigned to Hut 14. He sat on his cot, a wooden frame with a straw-filled mattress. He stared at the new cut pine of the wall. The propaganda had told them of the subhuman, brutal Americans. Instead, they were being guarded by polite, aging men who treated them not with hatred, but with a kind of weary pity. The propaganda had told them they were conquering the world. Instead, they had been shipped to a place that the world had forgotten. A place where the land itself in its vast, silent indifference was the true prison. The war, the Reich, the Führer. It all felt impossibly far away. That night, Thomas lay on his bunk. He listened to the sounds, the wind through the forest, the waves crashing against the shore, and something else, something distant and primal, a howl. Wolves. He closed his eyes and saw Dresden, the Altmark square crowded with people, his mother, his sister Margaret, her two little daughters. They were waving, but when he tried to run to them in his dream, they faded into mist, and all that remained was the sound of wolves howling in an endless forest. He woke with a start, sweat on his forehead despite the cold. He looked out the small window. Lake Superior stretched under the moon, silver, vast, indifferent. The forest was a black wall beyond, and Thomas Weber understood something fundamental. The propaganda had been a lie, but so had his understanding of the world. Germany had seemed so large, so powerful, the center of everything. But this place, this impossible, empty, beautiful, terrifying place, it made Germany seem small. It made the war seem small. It made him feel like a grain of sand on a beach that stretched forever. He thought about his mother's last letter, written before he had shipped out on U-537. She had told him to come home safely. She had told him the war would be over soon, that Germany would win, that everything would return to normal. But normal no longer existed. And Thomas, lying on a straw mattress, in a wooden barracks in the middle of a Minnesota forest, realized something that would take months to fully understand. He was not just a prisoner of war. He was a man who had fallen off the edge of the world, and there was no way back. November 22nd, 1943, 6 in the morning, Thomas Weber's first full day as a prisoner of war. The bugle cracked through the cold air like a gunshot, sharp, insistent, impossible to ignore. Thomas rolled off his bunk, his body stiff from the thin mattress, his breath visible in the freezing air of Hut 14. Around him, the other prisoners stirred, groaning, coughing. The smell of unwashed men packed too closely together. Klaus Brenner sat on the edge of his bunk, rubbing his face with both hands. "What do you think they will feed us?" Klaus asked quietly. Thomas pulled on his boots. "Prison rations, I imagine. Bread, maybe some thin soup." They filed out into the dawn. The sky was pale gray, streaked with pink along the eastern horizon. The air was so cold, it hurt to breathe. Frost covered everything, the barracks, the fence posts, the bare ground of the compound. The mess hall was warm. Steam rose from vents in the roof. The smell hit Thomas as soon as he stepped through the door. Coffee, real coffee. Not the ersatz garbage they had been drinking in Germany for the past 2 years. Not roasted grain or chicory root. Actual coffee. Rich, dark, American. Thomas picked up a metal tray and moved through the serving line. An American soldier, middle-aged and bored, looking ladled food onto his tray without comment, without hostility. Just the mechanical efficiency of a man doing a job he had done 1,000 times before. Thomas looked down at his tray. His hands began to shake. On the dented metal surface sat 2 thick slices of white bread. Not the dense, dark rye bread of Germany. White bread, soft, fresh. The kind Thomas had not seen since before the war. Next to the bread, a generous pat of real butter. Yellow, glistening. Not margarine, not lard. Butter, a small tin cup of raspberry jam. Deep red, gleaming like jewels. 2 fried eggs. The yolks were bright yellow. Whole, unbroken, cooked perfectly. 3 strips of bacon, crispy, dark at the edges, the fat still sizzling slightly. The smell was intoxicating. Salt, smoke, richness, and a steaming mug of coffee. Black, strong enough to strip paint. Thomas stood frozen in the middle of the mess hall, staring at the tray. Klaus Brenner stood beside him. Klaus was 29 years old, a veteran of the Afrika Korps. He had fought at El Alamein. He had survived the brutal retreat through Libya. He had endured sandstorms and artillery barrages and the constant gnawing hunger of a supply line stretched too thin. And now Klaus Brenner, hardened combat veteran, began to cry. His shoulders shook. Tears ran down his weathered face. He made no sound, but the tears kept coming. Thomas touched his arm. "Klaus, what is wrong?" Klaus could not speak for a moment. He just stared at the food. Finally, he whispered, "This is more than my wife has seen in a year." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. He looked around the mess hall. Every prisoner wore the same expression: shock, confusion. Some were eating slowly, reverently, as if the food might disappear if they moved too quickly. Others, like Klaus, were too overwhelmed to even begin. "They are mocking us," Klaus said, his voice hollow. "This must be a trick." But it was not a trick. Thomas sat at a long wooden table. He picked up a strip of bacon. The texture was perfect, crispy on the outside, still tender inside. He took a bite. The taste exploded in his mouth. Salt, fat, smoke, richness he had almost forgotten existed. For a moment, he was transported back to childhood. Sunday morning breakfast in Dresden. His mother frying bacon in the kitchen. His sister setting the table. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. Then reality crashed back. His mother was in Dresden, under Allied bombs, rationed to starvation levels. His sister and her 2 little girls were probably eating potato soup and stale bread, if they were eating at all. And here he was, a prisoner, an enemy, being fed better than he had ever been fed. Zahed was a frontline soldier of the Wehrmacht. The psychological impact was devastating. Cruelty Thomas could have understood. Hatred, brutality, those were the currencies of war. But this abundance, this casual generosity, It short-circuited everything the propaganda had told him. Americans were supposed to be barbaric, savage. They were supposed to starve and torture their prisoners. That was what Goebbels had promised. That was what every German soldier believed. But Goebbels had lied. And if Goebbels had lied about this, what else had he lied about? Thomas finished his breakfast in silence. Around him, the mess hall was quiet. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on metal trays and the occasional muffled sob of a man confronting the collapse of his worldview. After breakfast, Major Patterson addressed them in the compound. He stood on a wooden platform, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He spoke in careful formal German. "Gentlemen, your rank exempts you from labor under the Geneva Convention. You may remain in your barracks if you choose." He paused. Let the silence stretch. However, only those who volunteer for work will receive the full workers' ration. That includes cigarettes, chocolate, extra bread, and jam. Another pause. Those who choose not to work will receive the basic ration as stipulated by the convention. He did not need to elaborate. Everyone understood. The basic ration was survival, bread and water, enough to live. Nothing more. The workers' ration was what they had just eaten. Bacon, eggs, coffee, butter, comfort. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Steiner stepped forward. 45 years old, ramrod straight despite his rumpled uniform. His voice was sharp, authoritative. "I am an officer of the Wehrmacht. I will not labor like a common peasant." Major Patterson looked at him. His expression did not change. "That is your choice, Colonel. You will receive the basic ration." Steiner's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The next morning, 90% of the NCOs, including Thomas, volunteered to work. They were marched out of the compound at dawn. The guards were not like any guards Thomas had ever seen. They were old men, 60, 65, some even older. They walked slowly. They smoked pipes. They did not shout. They did not point rifles. Sergeant Daniel Harrison led Thomas's work detail. 61 years old, weathered face, gray hair, a tattoo on his forearm that Thomas could not quite make out. Harrison's rifle was slung casually over his shoulder. He walked beside the prisoners like a farmer leading livestock to pasture. "Keep up, boys. It's a mile to the cutting area." The forest swallowed them. Thomas had thought the view from the camp was impressive, but being inside the forest was different. The trees were enormous. White pines and spruces that stretched hundreds of feet into the sky. The trunks were so thick, Thomas could not have wrapped his arms around them. The canopy blocked out most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight. The forest floor was covered in moss and fallen needles. The smell was overwhelming. Pine resin, damp earth, decay. It was ancient, primeval, a place that had existed long before humans and would exist long after. They reached the cutting area, a clearing where previous crews had already felled dozens of trees. The logs lay like fallen giants, their bark still fresh, their wood pale and raw. Harrison handed out tools, axes, two-man crosscut saws called misery whips for reasons that would soon become obvious. Thomas took an axe. The handle was smooth, worn by countless hands before his. The head was heavy, sharp. He had never used an axe before. He was a machinist. His hands were accustomed to delicate work, precision instruments, micrometers, and calipers. This was different. He approached a tree, a spruce perhaps 60 feet tall. He swung the axe, the blade bit into the wood. Not deeply, maybe half an inch. His hands stung from the impact. His shoulders ached. He swung again and again. Within an hour, his palms were raw. Within 2 hours, blisters formed. By noon, the blisters had burst. His hands were bloody. Every swing sent pain shooting up his arms. But he kept working. Because that night, while he sat in the mess hall eating his full ration with a square of chocolate and 2 cigarettes on the side, Lieutenant Colonel Steiner sat alone in his cold barracks, chewing on a piece of plain bread, drinking water, watching the workers through the window with hollow, hungry eyes. The days blurred together. Thomas learned to swing an axe properly, how to read the grain of the wood, how to make the blade bite deep instead of glancing off. His hands hardened. Calluses formed over the raw patches. His shoulders and back grew stronger. He worked alongside Friedrich Vogel, a Fallschirmjäger paratrooper who had jumped into Crete. Friedrich was 26, lean and tough. He attacked the trees with a kind of fury. In this country, Friedrich grunted as they pulled a cross-cut saw back and forth. Even the trees are arrogant. The sound of axes echoed through the forest. Whack, whack, whack. A rhythm that became almost meditative. And beneath it, the rasping zing shush of the saws cutting through wood. The smell of fresh-cut pine was sharp, clean, almost medicinal. Sergeant Harrison supervised from a distance. He sat on a stump cleaning his pipe with a penknife. He watched them, but not like a hawk. More like a farmer watching cattle. A detached, proprietary presence. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was practical. Matter of fact. Take a break, drink some water. Or, that tree's leaning wrong. Step back before it falls. There was no hostility, no hatred, just the quiet authority of a man who had seen too much to waste energy on emotion. December arrived, and with it, the first real cold. Thomas had thought he understood winter. Dresden had cold winters, snow, freezing temperatures. But Minnesota winter was something else entirely. One morning in early December, Thomas was chopping at a stubborn spruce. The wood was frozen, making it harder to cut. The axe head was not seated properly on the handle. He should have noticed, should have stopped to fix it. But he was tired, cold, focused only on meeting the day's quota. He swung hard, the blade bit deep into the trunk, and the axe head, poorly fitted, flew off the handle. It sailed through the air and disappeared into a deep snowdrift. Thomas's heart stopped. In the Wehrmacht, losing equipment was a serious offense, a formal charge, punishment detail, maybe confinement. His hands shook as he approached Sergeant Harrison. He stood at attention. Old habits died hard. Sergeant, Gefreiter Weber reports, I have lost the head of my axe. Harrison looked up slowly. He squinted at Thomas, his pipe clenched between his teeth. Lost it where in the snow? Over there, sir. I cannot find it. Harrison sighed. It was not anger, just the tired frustration of a man dealing with one more inconvenience in a long day. Right. Well, you cannot bloody well cut wood without it, can you? Show me where. For 10 minutes, the German prisoner and the American guard searched together. They prodded the snow with sticks. They dug with their hands. The cold bit through Thomas's wet gloves. Finally, Harrison's boot hit something solid. He reached down and pulled up the steel axe head. Snow clung to the blade. There now, take this back to the tool shed. Get Corporal Martinez to rehang it. And try not to throw it at a moose next time, eh? That is all? Herr Sergeant Harrison looked baffled. What else is there? Go on. Get. Thomas walked back to camp, his mind reeling. No punishment, no shouting, no formal reprimand. Just a practical problem, stated and solved. This lack of overt hostility was maddening. It gave them nothing to push against, nothing to hate. The guards treated them not as monsters, but as inconvenient long-term employees. And slowly, the rigid Wehrmacht discipline began to erode. Lieutenant Colonel Steiner tried to maintain control. He held formations in the compound. He demanded salutes. He barked orders at the prisoners. But his authority was hollow. He could not punish anyone. He could not reduce rations or assign extra duty. Only the Americans could do that, and the Americans did not care about Wehrmacht hierarchy. By Christmas, Steiner had lost 20 pounds. His uniform hung on him. His face was gaunt, his eyes were sunken. He was perpetually cold because he refused to work, and the basic ration did not provide enough calories to maintain body heat in the Minnesota winter. One morning, as Thomas prepared the draft horses for the day's log haul, Steiner emerged from his barracks, shaking. Weak. Weber, your posture is lax. You are a disgrace to the Kriegsmarine. Thomas did not salute. He barely looked up from adjusting the harness. With respect, Harrow burst, you are in the way. Steiner's face flushed. You will address me properly. Thomas finally met his eyes. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm. Sir, the only authority here belongs to the Americans, and they respect those who work. Steiner opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but no words came, because Thomas was right. The old power structures had been frozen solid, shattered by the Minnesota winter and the polite, implacable authority of men who did not care about rank or ideology. Steiner turned and retreated to his barracks. He was no longer a leader. He was just a man who was hungry. February 9th, 1944, 7 in the morning, 42 degrees below zero. Thomas stepped out of Hut 14 into an atmosphere that did not feel like air. It felt like a physical substance, sharp, abrasive, hostile. To breathe in too quickly was to feel 1,000 tiny needles drive into his lungs. The bugle call cracked and shattered in the stillness. The sound was brittle, strange. The entire camp was buried, snow piled in drifts higher than the barracks. The paths had been dug out, creating white canyons. Walking through them felt like moving through trenches. Lake Superior groaned in the distance. Deep, resonant thumps as the ice shifted under its own massive weight. It sounded like artillery, like a frozen god turning over in his sleep. Inside the mess hall, the air was thick with fog. Hot coffee and frying pork in the breath of 200 men. The windows were frosted over completely, opaque with ice crystals. A new arrival sat at Thomas's table. Luigi Moretti, an Italian prisoner from the failed defense of Sicily, 23 years old, thin, terrified. He rocked back and forth, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug like it was the only solid thing in the universe. "We will die here," Luigi whispered. His eyes were wide, unfocused. "They brought us here to freeze. This is their plan." Sergeant Harrison, making his morning rounds, overheard. He stopped. Not to punish, to correct. Like a father correcting a child who had gotten a simple fact wrong. "Nonsense, son. You have got 3/4 quart of birch stacked outside your hut. You have got long underwear. You have got 4,000 calories on that plate." Harrison gestured to the pot-bellied stove in the corner. The metal glowed dull red. "You are better off than I am. My wife's furnace in Duluth is on the fritz." He clapped Luigi on the shoulder and moved on. Luigi stared after him, speechless. The guard had not only dismissed his existential terror, but had complained about domestic problems, as if a furnace malfunction and 42 below zero in a prison camp were equivalent inconveniences. It was the most American thing imaginable. The work continued. Even in the brutal cold, the prisoners skidded logs down to the frozen lake using draft horses. The logs would be floated to the pulp mill in spring. Thomas, now hardened and sinewy, had become a competent woodsman. His hands were like leather. His shoulders were thick with muscle he had never had before. He found to his surprise that he enjoyed it. The physical exhaustion, the quantifiable result of a day's labor. The silence of the forest. The simplicity. Late February, a new group of prisoners arrived. These were not the professionals of 42 and 43. These were hollow-eyed fanatics. Hitler youth barely old enough to shave. Old men from the Volkssturm, terrified and confused. Among them was Lieutenant Martin Richter, SS, 28 years old, a true believer. His eyes burned with ideological fervor that had not yet been extinguished by reality. Richter held secret meetings in the barracks at night. Thomas overheard fragments. "We are still soldiers of the Reich. We must maintain discipline. We must resist." Richter was planning something. Thomas could feel it. So could Klaus. "Should we tell the Americans?" Klaus asked quietly one night. Thomas did not answer immediately. He thought about Werner, the 19-year-old Hitler youth who followed Richter like a puppy. About Otto, the young Kriegsmarine sailor. About Paul, the infantry veteran. "They will die out there," Thomas said finally. "If they try to escape, the forest will kill them." Klaus shrugged. Natural selection. But Thomas felt uneasy. April 15th, 1944. 3 in the morning. Richter's group cut through a section of fence they had carefully loosened over weeks. 4 men, Werner, Otto, Paul, and Richter himself. They stole rations, bread, dried meat, matches. They took 2 compasses from the tool shed. They headed west toward what they believed was freedom. By 6 in the morning roll call, they were gone. Major Patterson was informed. He called Sergeant Harrison into his office. "Find them before they die." "How hard should I look, sir?" "Hard enough to say you tried. Not so hard, you risk your own men." Harrison and 3 soldiers tracked them. It was not difficult. The Germans left a trail like wounded elephants. Broken branches, footprints, patches of disturbed snow. Day 1, Richter's group was confident. The forest was thicker than expected, but they pushed forward. Their compasses began acting strangely. The area had iron deposits. The needles spun. By nightfall, they had covered perhaps 3 miles. Day 2, they were lost. Every tree looked identical. The canopy blocked the sun. They could not navigate. Their rations were running low. They had eaten too much on day one, driven by nervous energy. Otto suggested turning back. Richter refused. We are soldiers. We continue. Night of day 2, the temperature dropped to 25 degrees. They lit a fire with shaking hands. In the darkness, they heard howling. Wolves. Close. Very close. Werner cried quietly, trying not to show fear. Day 3. Werner had hypothermia. His lips were blue. His hands would not stop shaking. Paul's feet were badly blistered. He could barely walk. Richter finally admitted defeat. We must go back. But they did not know which direction back was. 2 in the afternoon, day 3. Sergeant Harrison found them huddled under a rock overhang. Werner was unconscious. Otto and Paul could not stand. Harrison looked at them, not with anger, with something closer to pity. Goddamn fools, you made it 6 miles from camp. Richter even now tried to maintain defiance. We are not afraid of you. Harrison gestured at the forest around them, the endless trees, the crushing silence. You should be afraid of this. Not me. They carried Werner on a stretcher. Harrison gave Paul his own canteen. The march back took 3 hours. At camp, the American doctor amputated 2 of Werner's toes, severe frostbite. The toes were black, dead. There was no saving them. Major Patterson's judgment was swift. 2 weeks isolation, reduced rations. You are damn lucky Private Werner did not die. Richter tried to protest. You have no right. Patterson cut him off. I have every right, and I have every reason to let you try again. But I will not, because I am not a murderer. The other prisoners saw Werner's bandaged feet. They saw Richter's hollow defeat. The message was clear. The wilderness was the real prison. 6 miles, that was how far you could get before the land itself stopped you. 1 week after the failed escape, Thomas and Harrison sat on a log during lunch break. They ate in silence for a while. Then Thomas asked the question he had been wanting to ask for months. Sergeant Harrison, why do you treat us like this? Like what with kindness? We are the enemy. Harrison was quiet for a long time. He stared at the trees. Finally, he rolled up his sleeve. On his forearm was a tattoo, USS Arizona. Jack Harrison, 1941. Thomas's eyes widened. Your son? Harrison's voice was flat, emotionless. But Thomas could hear the weight beneath the words. My boy Jack, enlisted in the Navy 1940, proud as hell. December 7th, 1941, he was on the Arizona at Pearl Harbor. 1177 men died on that ship. My Jack was one of them. He was 19 years old. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. I am sorry. Harrison looked at him. The Japs killed my boy. Not you. You are just kids who got told to fight. Same as him. He stood brushing off his pants. That is why I do not hate you. But do not mistake kindness for weakness. You try to run, I will shoot you. Rules are rules. Thomas watched him walk away. For the first time, he saw Harrison not as a guard, but as a father who had lost his son. A man who chose kindness over hatred because hatred had already taken too much. June 7, 1944. Major Patterson pinned a newspaper to the bulletin board. The headline was 3 inches tall, Invasion Allies Land in Normandy. The prisoners crowded around, silent, reading. Lists of German divisions captured or destroyed. Photos of burning panzers. The names of French towns now reduced to rubble. Klaus stared at a photo. His face went gray. They are dying, Thomas. All of them. Everyone we knew. And we are here eating bacon and cutting trees. The guilt settled over the camp like fog. January 1945. The first letters from home arrived. They came in batches, stacked in canvas mail bags that had traveled across an ocean and half a continent. Major Patterson distributed them in the mess hall after breakfast. He called out names. One by one, prisoners stepped forward. Some received nothing. Their faces remained blank, but their eyes told the story. No letter meant no one left to write. Thomas heard his name. He walked to the front, his heart pounding. Patterson handed him a single envelope. Thin, light. The address was written in handwriting he did not recognize. He sat at a table. Klaus sat across from him, holding his own letter. Klaus was crying, tears of relief. His family was alive. His wife and 2 children were in the British zone, safe, fed, together. Thomas turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper was cheap. The stamp was censored. The return address said only Dresden, Germany. He opened it carefully. The letter was from Frau Dietrich, a neighbor, an old woman who had lived 3 doors down from his family's apartment building. The letter was dated October 1944, 3 months ago. Most of the text was blacked out. Thick bars of ink covered entire sentences, entire paragraphs. The censors had been thorough. Thomas read what remained. Dear Thomas, I am sorry to write with such news. Your mother, censored. The bombing on censored was very bad. Your sister Margaret and her daughters, censored. The alt marked is censored. There is nothing left of censored. I am in the countryside now. Many have left. I do not know if this letter will reach you. If it does, please know that your mother's last words were censored. I pray you are safe wherever you are. Frau Dietrich. Thomas read the letter 3 times. He did not cry. He could not. The shock was too complete. He simply sat staring at the censored lines, trying to fill in the blanks with his imagination. Trying not to fill them in, Klaus reached across the table, put his hand on Thomas's arm. What does it say? Thomas's voice was hollow. Empty. I do not know. Everything is blacked out. But I think my family is gone. The words felt unreal. Abstract. My family is gone. As if he were talking about strangers, as if the words applied to someone else's life. But they did not. They applied to his mother. 62 years old, gray hair always pulled back in a tight bun, hands that smells like flour and lavender soap. She had kissed his forehead the day he left for the Navy. Be safe, Thomas. Come home to me. His sister Margaret, 31, 2 little girls, Emma age 7, Lotte age 4. He remembered their faces. Remembered Emma's gap-toothed smile. Lotta's habit of hiding behind her mother's skirts. All of them. Gone. Erased. While he had been learning to swing an axe and complaining about the cold, his entire family had been incinerated. The irony was crushing. The polite imprisonment that had felt like mercy now felt like torture. He had been saved, fed, kept warm and safe, while his mother and sister and nieces had been burned alive under Allied bombs. American bombs, British bombs, the bombs of the same nations that now fed him bacon and eggs every morning. Thomas stood abruptly. He walked out of the mess hall, across the compound, past the barracks, to the fence at the edge of camp. He stood there for a long time, staring at Lake Superior. The water was dark, choppy. Ice chunks floated near the shore. Beyond the lake stretched to an infinite horizon. He thought about jumping the fence, walking into the forest, disappearing. It would be easy. The guards were old, inattentive. He could be gone before anyone noticed. But where would he go? Back to Germany, to a pile of rubble that used to be a city, to search through ash for the bodies of people who were already gone, or into the forest, to die of cold and starvation like Richter's escape party. There was nowhere to go. He was trapped, not by barbed wire, not by guards, but by the simple fact that the world he had known no longer existed. Sergeant Harrison appeared beside him, silent. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply stood there, smoking his pipe, looking out at the same water. After a long silence, Harrison spoke. You got a letter? It was not a question. Yes, bad news. Thomas nodded. I think my family is dead. I cannot be sure. The censors blacked out most of it, but the parts I can read. He trailed off. Harrison was quiet for another minute. Then he said, the war does not stop just because you are not there anymore, son. But being here, being alive, that is not something to feel guilty about. You did not choose this. Thomas turned to look at him. But my family chose nothing either. And they are dead, while I am safe. Harrison knocked his pipe against the fence post. The burnt tobacco fell into the snow. Your family would want you alive. Trust me on that. How do you know? Because I am a father. And if my boy Jack had survived Pearl Harbor, if he had been captured and held in some Japanese camp, I would have thanked God every day that he was alive, even if I was not. Thomas had no answer to that. They stood in silence until the cold became unbearable. Then they walked back to camp together. The letters changed the camp. The men who received good news kept it quiet out of respect for those who had not. The men who received bad news became ghosts. They worked, they ate, they slept. But something essential had gone out of them. Steiner received no letter at all. He sat alone in his barracks, staring at nothing. His pride had sustained him for months, but pride could not fill the void left by silence. By spring, Thomas had gained 20 pounds, all muscle. His hands were calloused like wood. His shoulders were broad. His face was tanned and weathered. He looked like a lumberjack, which in every practical sense he had become. The war news kept coming. The Allies crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces entered Germany from the east. Berlin was surrounded. The Reich was collapsing. And still the prisoners cut wood. May 8th, 1945, 11 in the morning. A whistle blew, not for work detail, full assembly. The prisoners filed onto the parade ground. The sound of spring was everywhere. Lake Superior breaking up, the ice booming like distant artillery, the smell of thawing pine needles. Damp earth, life returning after the brutal winter. Major Patterson stood on the steps of the main hall. He held a single sheet of paper. His face was expressionless. The camp fell silent. Even the fanatics, the hardliners who still wore their ideology like armor, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Patterson raised the paper and read in a flat, emotionless voice. Gentlemen, I have an announcement from Allied Supreme Command. As of 23:01 hours Central European Time, May 7th, all forces of the German High Command have surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. The silence that followed was not human. It was the silence of the wilderness itself, a vast, crushing vacuum. Thomas stood frozen. He felt the spring breeze on his face, heard a woodpecker hammering at a tree just outside the wire. The sound seemed impossibly loud. The war was over. The words made no sense. The war was the world. It was the axis on which his entire life had turned. It was the reason he had joined the Navy, the reason he had been on U-537, the reason he was here. And now it was simply over. A scream shattered the silence. It came from Eric Kessler, 17 years old, SS, a true believer who had arrived with the last batch of prisoners. His face was white with rage. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Lies. It is a trick. The Führer lives. The Wunderwaffen are coming. You are liars. He lunged at Klaus Brenner, who stood next to him. Traitor. You believe this. Before Kessler could take 2 steps, Sergeant Harrison moved. Despite his age, he was fast. He grabbed Kessler by the front of his tunic and lifted him half off the ground. Harrison's face was inches from the boy's. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, cold growl. The war is over. You lost. Your Führer put a bullet in his own head in a bunker in Berlin. Your 1,000-year Reich is a pile of bricks. He shoved Kessler, who stumbled and fell into the mud. The boy lay there sobbing, broken. Harrison looked around at the assembled prisoners. Anyone else? No one moved. Lieutenant Colonel Steiner stared at his boots. His face was hollow. His pride, his rank, his entire purpose had been built on a foundation that was now officially gone. He was just a cold, hungry man in a tattered uniform in the middle of a Minnesota forest. Patterson folded the paper. You are no longer prisoners of war. You are now classified as surrendered enemy personnel. You will remain in this facility pending repatriation. The whistle for midday meal will blow in 10 minutes. Dismissed. And that was it. No celebration from the Americans, no taunting, no triumphant flag raising. The war did not end with a bang. It ended with a polite announcement followed by the promise of lunch. Thomas walked back to Hut 14 in a daze. Klaus walked beside him, shoulders slumped. It is finished, Klaus whispered. He pulled a worn photo from his breast pocket. His wife and 2 children standing in front of a church. Are they still there, Thomas? Is Dresden still there? Thomas had no answer. He realized with cold dread that his comfortable, well-fed imprisonment had been a grotesque mercy. While he had been learning to swing an axe, his entire country had been incinerated. The next morning, Sergeant Martinez handed out the saws as usual. Friedrich Vogel stared at him confused. But the war is over. Martinez sipped his coffee. That is right, son. So why are we cutting wood? Martinez looked at him like he was an idiot. Because the contract with Superior Pulp and Paper Mill does not expire until March 1946. You are still getting paid, are you not? You are still eating, are you not? Well, someone has got to cut the wood. Get to it. Thomas shouldered his axe. He walked into the forest. The spring birds were singing. The air smelled of thawing earth and new growth. He stood before a massive white pine and realized something profound. He was no longer a soldier of the Reich. He was no longer a prisoner of war. He was a lumberjack. A well-fed, well-paid, displaced employee of the United States government. And standing there with the axe in his hands and the smell of pine all around him, Thomas Weber made a decision. November 1945. Most of the prisoners had been sent back to Germany. The camp was emptying. Barracks that had once housed 200 men now housed 50, then 30, then 20. Thomas was scheduled to leave in February. Back to Germany, back to whatever remained. One afternoon, working side by side with Sergeant Harrison clearing fallen timber, Harrison said something that stopped Thomas cold. "You are not going back, are you?" It was not a question. Thomas paused. "How did you know?" Harrison lit his pipe. "I have been doing this job for 3 years now. I can tell the ones who want to leave from the ones who do not." He exhaled smoke. "Cannot say I blame you. From what I hear, Germany is, well, it is not good." Thomas drove his axe into a stump. "I have no one left there." "You got skills now. You are a hell of a woodsman. There is work up here, real work, not prison labor. Logging companies always need men." Thomas looked at him, surprised. "You would help me stay?" "Why not? War is over. You did not commit any crimes. Just ended up on the wrong side. America is built on folks getting second chances." Harrison paused. "There is a logging camp 50 miles north. Foreman is a friend. Jack Thornton. I could put in a word. Pay is decent. Hard work, but you know that already." Thomas felt something shift inside him, a door opening that he had not known existed. "I need time to think. Take your time. Offer stands till you ship out." Thomas thought about it for weeks. He lay awake at night staring at the ceiling of Hut 14, weighing his options. Return to Germany, to search through the ruins of Dresden for a family that was already gone, to try to rebuild a country that had been destroyed by its own leaders, or stay here in this vast, empty, indifferent land that had become more familiar than home. March 15th, 1946. Liberation Day. The final repatriation. Camp Northwood was closing. 20 prisoners stood in the cold morning air. Trucks waited to take them to trains, then ships to Europe. Klaus Brenner hugged Thomas goodbye. "Come with me, Thomas. Come to Germany. Help us rebuild." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Klaus, I do not know if I can. Everything I knew is gone. But it is home." Thomas looked past Klaus at the forest, at Lake Superior, at the endless wilderness that had been his prison and his salvation. "Is it? I do not even know what that word means anymore." Klaus hugged him tighter. "Then stay. Be safe. Be happy. You deserve that." Thomas watched Klaus climb into the truck. Then he walked to Sergeant Harrison, who stood by the gate with a duffel bag. "Foreman's name is Jack Thornton. Tell him I sent you. He will set you up." Thomas took the bag. "Sergeant, I do not know how to thank you." Harrison was uncomfortable with gratitude. He waved it away. "Do not thank me. You did the work. You made the choice." He extended his hand. "Good luck, Thomas." Thomas shook it. "Sir, why did you help me?" Harrison looked out at Lake Superior. A long pause. "Because my boy Jack did not get a second chance, but you did. Do not waste it." 22 years later, summer 1968. Thomas Weber stood in the parking lot of the VFW Hall in Grand Marais, Minnesota. He was 49 years old now, an American citizen since 1952. He owned a small logging operation. He was married to Sarah, a kind woman he had met at a church social in 1950. They had 2 children, Margaret 15, Daniel 12. He spoke English with only a slight German accent. His children spoke no German at all. They were American, completely, utterly. Thomas had received a letter from Daniel Harrison. "Dear Thomas, you may not remember me, or perhaps you do. I was Sergeant Daniel Harrison, Veterans Guard Camp Northwood. I am writing because there is to be a reunion of guards and former prisoners in Grand Marais this August. It has been 22 years. I would be honored if you would attend. Respectfully, Daniel Harrison, retired." Inside the hall, 12 former guards, most in their 70s and 80s, 8 former prisoners who had stayed in America. Friedrich Vogel was there, an engineer at Ford in Detroit now, married, 3 kids, and across the room, older and grayer, but with the same steady eyes, Daniel Harrison. Thomas walked over. Sergeant Harrison. Harrison smiled. He stood with difficulty, his knees stiff. Just Dan now. Been retired for 15 years. They shook hands. Then Harrison pulled him into a brief hug. You look like you have done all right. I have. Thanks to you. Harrison waved it away. Ah, hell, you did the work. That evening they drove out to the site of Camp Northwood. Nothing remained. The barracks were gone. The forest had reclaimed everything. Only concrete foundations and rusted fence posts marked where the prison had stood. Thomas walked to where Hut 14 had been. He touched a weathered post and remembered. The first night, the fear, the wolves howling, the feeling of being forgotten by the world, and then the transformation. Learning to swing an axe, the abundance paradox of the breakfast, Harrison's quiet authority. The day the war ended, Friedrich joined him. Strange is it not, this place saved us. Thomas nodded. Yes, it was a prison that set us free, the politest prison in the world. At sunset, Thomas and Dan stood on the shore of Lake Superior. The water was on fire with golden red, the same view Thomas had seen 24 years earlier, but through different eyes. Beautiful is it not, never gets old. Thomas smiled. I hated this view once. It terrified me. All that emptiness. And now I think it is the reason I am alive. The emptiness gave me space to become someone new. In Germany, I would have been Thomas Weber, sailor and a sunken U-boat citizen of a destroyed country. Here I am just Thomas, father, husband, logger. The wilderness did not care who I was. So I got to choose. Harrison nodded. That is America for you. Big enough for people to get lost in, big enough for people to find themselves. A pause, the waves rolled in, eternal, indifferent, beautiful. I am glad you stayed, Thomas. So am I, Dan. So am I. They stood in silence. 2 old men, once guard and prisoner, now just friends, watching the sun set over the Great Lake. Between 1943 and 1946, over 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. Unlike the brutal conditions in many camps around the world, German prisoners in America were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, often better than American soldiers serving overseas. Approximately 5,000 German prisoners chose to remain in the United States after the war, becoming citizens, contributing to American society, building new lives in a country that had once been their enemy. They captured Thomas Weber with kindness. They imprisoned him with geography. They defeated him with normalcy. And in doing so, they gave him something the war never could, a future. Thomas came to Minnesota as a prisoner of war. He left as a free man, and he stayed because he realized something fundamental. Freedom is not about where you are from. It is about where you choose to be. This is what made America great. Not cruelty, not revenge, but the simple revolutionary idea that even enemies can become neighbors if you treat them with dignity. The wilderness did not care about ideology. The lake did not care about flags. The forest did not care about the Reich or the Führer or the propaganda. The land simply was vast, indifferent, beautiful, terrifying, and ultimately freeing. And in that indifference, Thomas Weber found something he had never expected to find. He found home.